Thanks for the introduction. I'm Jake Nachlas. I work at Home Depot. I'm really excited to be here. We came up today from South Florida. My buddy John over there, my former boss and now one of my good buddies. There's already a bit of an introduction, but like Wes already said, living in Miami Beach now. I just moved there a few weeks ago. Was in Boca. I like rock climbing, Marvel, love watching hockey and soccer. Big Inter Miami fan. Okay, I got one boo. I was waiting for that. I was waiting for that all week. I'm also a Chelsea fan. I was actually here last summer. Another boo. All right. I was here last summer at Camping World, where Chelsea played Arsenal. Did not do well. Haven't been back since, but that's okay.
That concludes our.
That's it. Yeah. So just a bit more about me. I studied data science at Emory up in Atlanta. I was talking to someone who you were in Atlanta. Yep. And then after that, I did some freelance design and then started working at OGK Creative. And that's where I really had the first opportunity to explore and create AR experiences for companies like Platform Science, which is a fleet management company, Celsius, the energy drink, New York Mets, who, if you don't know them, they're famous for being lower than the Marlins in the standings, and Home Depot now. And even at Home Depot, I've been able to get involved in some VR stuff, mainly with the mentoring capacity. A lot of the software engineering interns who come in get to work on the cool stuff. And so I just get to help out where I can with the design of those VR applications for Home Depot. And then at night, like Wes mentioned, I actually just started my second semester of my master's program today. So I'm going to go home and watch class after this. But yeah, that's a bit about my experience. So obviously, I have 3 years of experience in the field. So who am I to be giving this presentation? And to be honest, I'm really just someone who's super interested in the space and exploring emerging technology in general. I've done a few projects, played around with it, done a lot of research online about what it is and what it means in the technology. And so today I just kind of want to share some things that I've learned about this awesome new field that to me is an inevitable form of computing. So just to start, who here has used some AR or VR experience? Cool, a bunch of you. Has anyone created one? An AR, VR? You have? Yeah, I know that. No one else? Okay. That's okay, because my first experience was very discouraging, to say the least. We were making a video walkthrough of all the features a fleet management company's software offers. It was for one of their trade shows. And at the time, I'd never really made anything for augmented reality. And had never really touched Unity, which is like a game engine, a game editor, or C#, which is the language you use to develop AR experiences. And we had 1 week to get it done. So obviously I was in a bit of a pickle. So here we are in these pictures here, testing the experience in a parking lot in the Florida heat in the summer, overheating, computer strapped to my face, trying to get our experience aligned with the truck using image markers. It was a very hot day, started raining a bit, and you can see my PC tower was right there in the middle of the parking lot. It was not great. If anyone's ever used a Magic Leap 1, it's not very friendly to technical or non-technical people rather, or even for someone like myself who's a little technical, but not as intense as someone who's maybe all in with this space. So it was a really tough first project that had a lot of frustrations, a lot of pivoting, but I obviously didn't want it to discourage me from continuing to explore the field. It's a super interesting field. But at that point, it was really hard for designers to get into the space because new technologies by nature are super technical, especially when you introduce a third dimension, because now we're dealing with 3D space. That makes it a lot harder to create prototypes too, because you can't really do it in Figma. You can make very light prototypes in Figma, but if you want to actually get someone to start testing it, it's not very practical to do that in a 2D medium. And it was pretty hard until pretty recently, actually. So every month now, there's really cool, really robust tools for not as technical people, no-code solutions to get into the field and create these really awesome AR and VR experiences. So it's actually a really good time right now to start learning about these new forms of computing. And if I were to start over with that nightmare of a truck experience that had me in the parking lot with my PC tower on a mat, then it would probably be a lot easier and a lot less discouraging. So that was a lot of negative things, but my goal today is to give you all a glimpse into the world of AR and VR, why UX is super important, how we can get into the space, some of the challenges we face with today's technology, specifically the hardware, some key terms, guidelines, and how you can get started. Cool, so that's the first section. So first of all, what are AR and VR? So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the terms themselves, but just in case you aren't, let's start with virtual reality. So virtual reality pretty much just means you're in a fully digital environment. You have some headset over your face, and everything around you is graphics. It's 3D graphics. There's no real connection to reality, what we see right now with each other. So like I said, yeah, it involves a headset with some controls, whether that's like a physical controller or just using your hands now. And you can even use your eyes, which I'll talk about later. And some examples, which I think I have like a bunch more mentions of this one. Here's my favorite game, Walkabout Mini Golf. If you like mini golf and you have a headset, I highly recommend Walkabout Mini Golf. And then you have Horizon Worlds there in the middle, which is Meta's app, and then Beat Saber, which maybe you're more familiar with. It's a very popular game. Then you have augmented reality, which is overlaying digital content onto the real world. So I can see all you, you can see all me, but now there's some digital enhancement in the space as well. That can be either on a mobile phone, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Pokemon Go or IKEA Place, or it can be on a headset. So you either have an augmented reality headset or you have a virtual reality headset and you can, it's called pass-through, you can see through. So either on your face or on your phone. And then that begs the question, what is mixed reality? Has anyone heard the term mixed reality or extended reality? Yes. So the lines are a bit blurry about mixed reality, but the way I interpret it is, it's kind of in between on the spectrum. Whereas augmented reality, you have these objects in the real space, whereas mixed reality takes it a step further, and mixed reality actually kind of anchors the digital elements to the space you're in. So whether I have a virtual game board on that table or a little Pokemon jumping on the tables, off the chairs, things like that. So yeah, it anchors digital objects to the real world environment. And then extended reality is the blanket term that covers AR, VR, MR, the whole spectrum. So all of this stuff is just extending reality to some degree. So just to look at the current landscape, some of the bigger players, especially for virtual reality, are Meta, HTC, Sony. So they have a PlayStation VR headset, which is really good. Haven't used it because I don't want to buy it, but I've seen really good things about it. ByteDance, which is actually the parent company of TikTok, they also have a really good headset. And then Big Screen VR is a smaller company, but I want to call it out because it's a really nice headset, mainly used for watching movies and shows, but it's really small, so it looks really cool. And then for augmented reality, Apple, Google, Snap, Niantic, a lot bigger companies are in that space because they don't need really fancy headsets to get involved there. They have their own developer kits for mobile AR, except Snap also now has a headset. And then mixed reality, similarly, you have Meta, Microsoft, now Apple with the Vision Pro, which was announced not too long ago, and Magic Leap, which was my nightmare experience, but they're better now. I don't have any, if anyone's from Magic Leap, I don't have anything against you. And then software, Unity, Unreal Engine, Lens Studio. So there's a lot of different options. And all of these companies are pretty much in a race to get to the best, smallest form factor, the headset that'll have the least impact on the person wearing it. I don't want to have this big bulky thing on my head. I just want to be able to experience AR and VR. And just some numbers down here, market size in 2022 was 42.2 billion for AR and 30.6 billion for VR. So obviously very big and a lot of opportunities there. And it's only supposed to grow and grow a lot over the next 7 years to 2030. So it's a very exciting time to get into the field, as I mentioned. And then here are some of the more popular use cases today. So you see like healthcare, auto, job training, education, social networks, navigation, virtual try-ons, things like that, e-commerce. And as you can see, it's a mix of enterprise and more business-focused use cases, and some consumer as well, obviously, because I'm sure some of us have used some of these experiences. For mixed reality or AR headsets specifically, right now there's much more value in enterprise when it comes to investing in a super nice headset and utilizing some spatial experience. There's a lot of reasons for that. I could probably spend an hour talking about it, but for some of the higher level things like immediate ROI, they can see things like training simulations or remote mechanical assistance or a marketing installation or environmental or interior designers using it to test out a space before committing to the actual physical space. or not having to deal with the same hurdles a consumer has to deal with, like cost or social acceptance. Some people are even using it to help improve customer experience, so kind of indirectly to the consumer, like virtual showrooms. But the customers in this case aren't the ones buying the headsets. The businesses are buying the headsets, especially the fancier ones. They can invest $3,500. Oh boy, is that me? Cool. On the new Vision Pro headset, for example, that can save them a lot more money than that. But consumers don't yet have that same value proposition. I'm not going to personally cut my expenditures by buying a Vision Pro, right? But people are catching on to it, I would say, more every year. But a very large number of people just still don't see a purpose in it besides being a cool and novel product. Overall, though, across each of these industries and categories, enterprise and consumer, AR and VR are actually becoming a lot more widely accepted every year, starting to be integrated into more parts of our lives, especially on mobile, and even on a headset too, whether that's directly through our own devices or indirectly through a business utilizing them to help improve the customer experience. So with that being said, I actually want to pose a question. Why are we not already at the next step of adoption and experiences across the board, and how can we get there? So first and foremost, something that's a bit out of our control is we can only create experiences as advanced as the available technology. For gamers, tech enthusiasts, designers, developers, and for a ton of really valuable enterprise use cases, the tech today is pretty sufficient already. What we have now is at least minimally viable for what we want to use it for. I'm not really using it to browse the web or productivity, but I might use it to experiment or play walkabout mini golf, which I highly recommend you all get. It was reported, I think, a few months ago, or maybe last year after the Meta Quest Pro came out, that not even people at Meta were really using the Quest Pro for work, and they were trying to target productivity users, people who can do their workday on this device. So for the everyday consumer, it's not quite there yet, but that's okay. There's a lot of constraints at play, like really expensive hardware that I mentioned. For the more powerful AR devices specifically, somewhat limited battery life, small field of view, making them feel a bit dinky, bulky, heavy, uncomfortable devices, which is never good. But as the hardware becomes more advanced, smaller, longer battery life, higher fidelity, cheaper, because they're pretty expensive right now, especially for the better ones, and more comfortable, we'll start to think a little bit less and less about its presence and disturbance, and be able to just enjoy the experience in front of, or in this case, around us. And when that happens, it should, in theory, continue to become more common for everyday consumers like us to own a mixed reality device. That is, if they have a good reason to. And so as it becomes more and more popular and the demand for great experiences continues to increase for consumers and for enterprise, it begs the question, how can we as UX designers contribute? How can we help with getting adoption to the next level? How can we create experiences that people who aren't using this technology yet, they'll actually want to use it? And so that's what we'll talk about now. The imperative of UX into AR and VR adoption. So to me, these are the biggest factors in adoption. Like we already kind of talked about the hardware ones, the cost, the comfort, the ability to move around freely without being tethered to some battery pack or to some power source. Perception, right? I'm not going to be working in a coffee shop with a huge device on my head. It looks weird, I think. But then there's the software, which is a bit more in our control. And there's perceived ease of use, perceived cost per value, general attitude and motivation, and perceived usefulness. And as for us UX designers, these things are super important to always consider if we want people to use our app. So I'm gonna go through each of these software related ones, things that we actually could have some control over. So perceived ease of use is the first one. How easy is it for me to pick up a device and start using the experience? We really want to try to minimize learning curve is our goal for any experience, whether it's AR, VR, or any other 2D online experience, right? We want to ensure that the interface feels natural and easy to navigate, right? It's a new technology. And so a lot of people will think it's pretty daunting or not very intuitive. So how can we as UX designers reduce that learning curve, make them feel more comfortable with the experience? Why would someone bother trying this new way of doing something if it'll be harder than what they're used to doing now, right? So we should always make sure that our experience should be easy to pick up and use and operate. should be easy to learn the controls and quickly become skilled at it, be perceived as not requiring a lot of mental effort, and should be super clear and understandable. Perceived cost per value. So we already talked about hardware costs being a huge barrier to entry, right? But for some people, it's worth it. The given application needs to be super beneficial to the user compared to the cost, like saving tons on training exercises by using a virtual environment, or experimenting with store layouts and testing them in VR before beginning construction to ensure they're customer friendly. If I have a $3,500 to spend on a headset, as you can see with my great visualization down here, the question is, do I get a single Vision Pro or 7 MetaQuest 2s, so 6 friends and I can play multiplayer walkabout mini golf all together at the same time? So the cost is just way too high for like the normal consumer to justify the nicer, more sleek, feature-rich headsets. You know, to some people, color pass-through and the Animoji facial reconstruction might be super cool and worth it. But like I said, I'll just stick to playing mini golf for now. Comfort. So this one's super important, obviously, because right now headsets are really bulky and heavy. For the headsets targeted towards productivity, even the lower cost ones, it's hard to wear them for a full work day. I don't know if any of you have ever tried that, but I don't recommend it. You think about the possibilities of having as many screens as you want while sitting in a comfy recliner, and it sounds pretty appealing, but at the cost of wearing a warm, heavy computer strapped to your face for hours, it's not as appealing. For now, I think I'm just going to stick to my one monitor and laptop. For headsets targeted towards gaming, moving around with a bulky thing on your head can also get tiring. Even for the lighter AR glasses like the Magic Leap, which, by the way, the Magic Leap 2 is a lot better than the 1, they get hot after a bit and are still squeezing your head. So there's not much incentive to use these headsets if they're not super comfortable to wear. So obviously, like I said, comfort's super important in adaptability of AR and VR, because it's uncomfortable to even wear the computer, then why bother with the technology? We should consider, time to use an experience. Is it super long to use it, or can they do it in intervals? If I'm standing up, how long do I have to stand for? The gestures to navigate. Am I holding my hands up the whole time, which is tiring, or are we considering more, the comfort of the users? And just things like that, so the users can always be comfortable when they're operating it. Otherwise, they'll just be discouraged from using it again. General attitude and motivation. So if it's perceived as delightful, enjoyable, entertaining, then people want to use it. They want to be able to see and experience this great thing that's, if anything, or if nothing else, fun to use. But poor UX can get in the way of that. If they're frustrated with not knowing what to do, it's not a very enjoyable experience. If they don't know how to use the controls and the application offers no way of guiding them to use it, it's not very fun or delightful. If it's just very dry and plain and not very exciting, if there aren't interesting interactions, it doesn't really evoke any positive emotion, which can also be discouraging to people. So how do we get people to say, like, wow, this makes doing X or Y or some task we're doing so much more enjoyable? And that'll be for us a step in the right direction. Take a quick water break. Perceived usefulness. So does this application help the user do something more easily than they could do it without the application? That's a huge one, right? Like, if it's not easier to do some given task, they're going to stick to what they know how to do. They're not going to invest money in this new device to do it. The AR application needs to be useful, or VR application needs to and maybe like enhance the quality of learning or the effectiveness of learning, or maybe enable the user to accomplish some task more quickly or easily or more accurately, things like that. As we talked about, enterprise use cases exist and are out there. But what about for an everyday consumer? Why would they put on one of these headsets? What are we providing to them that's way better than the way that they do now? And I want to pose the question, does anyone have an idea of maybe a good use case for a consumer-facing wearable AR or VR experience besides gaming? It's okay if not, but just wanted to put it out there. Car sales? Can you elaborate on that? Oh, you can kind of see it. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so that's a huge thing. Is like, Really?
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a super good example. So like commerce and just being able to see something in your space or just see something in your driveway in this case, before having to go to the store and be bombarded with salesmen is could be super valuable to people. Yeah, and you also had your hands up if either of you wanted to. No?
I reread the question and said, where again? AR, and it should fly.
Oh, it can be mobile.
Well, I was thinking like when you're driving, it's cool to like not just see the map, but it's cool to see like the overlay of
Yeah.
where you should turn. Sometimes it's like it's so confusing when you hear I think 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
No, 1,000 feet. It's like it's so hard to like gauge that.
You're just counting down 998, 997. Yeah, exactly.
So I think like if you're walking, you can actually see the overlay of like
Yeah.
the direction, but that could be a cool.
Yeah, that'd be super cool. No, that's okay. Yeah, even for mobile, or even if built into the car, right? If there's like a little heads-up display above the wheel that has like a little arrow that shows you turning on Orange Street, or I'm learning the streets here. I'm not from here, but I think Orange Street is one of them.
One of our virtual attendees, Daniel Gill, said realtors for house viewing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So realty is a big one too, both for staging so they can see what a space would look like, and also for showing spaces without actually have to go to the unit. So yeah, that's a super useful one. Oh my gosh, now the hands are popping up.
For students, medical students, were using learning different procedures. If we are done the equipment and then
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. And I even have some examples later in here with some medical use cases, both for training and education, but also for actually conducting the procedures.
I would say like look at the rim, say, okay, that's 45 degrees, and I was like, how to measure it.
Yeah, I think even Apple has like the Measure app, but to have that in like a yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll do one more.
I was gonna say, like flight simulator, for instance. I
Yes.
know that I have a lot of friends who are pilots. And spend a lot of time in the flight simulators. They're very large, expensive machines that have screens all the way around you. You can mitigate some of the cost in just one screen on your face.
Exactly.
Really drive down that.
Yeah, and that's especially important for some aviation company or even Delta who's training their pilots. They could have a pilot do 1,000 simulations before even having to expend the fuel or take a round trip, which is an expense in itself, right? So it saves these companies a lot of money. I don't know, like for some of these examples, they're super good. I don't know if like a consumer would buy a headset for this purpose per se, but like for business use cases and supplying it to the user, they're definitely super valuable. You had your hand? Okay, you can do it, Wes. Yeah. It's a little bit about them, yeah. Yeah, exactly. One thing. Well, I was in yeah. I was in New York this summer and I went to see Book of Mormon. Has anyone seen Book of Mormon? Yeah. It was super funny, crazy offensive, which is amazing. It's still on Broadway, but I thought it was super funny. But one of the things, I was in the way back, and one of the things I wish I had were subtitles. Has anyone watched Peaky Blinders? So that's when I started using subtitles. But I was thinking, like, how great would it be if I can't understand the singing or even the dialogue, if I could put on some glasses and just see the words that are being spoken or sung. Exactly. Yeah, or a translator. That's a super valuable use case. And I think Google or NVIDIA is doing something with that, where the glasses translate and kind of show the translation right in front of you. So it's super cool. And there's a lot of very useful applications. And I think as the headsets become a bit more compact and a bit more common for people to wear, a lot of these things are going to start popping up and really improve the way we're living and interacting with each other. So what is the designer's role? So developers if anyone's on tech Twitter, you'll see this, but developers are really good at, working every day and night, to push what's possible with these new technologies, whether it's AR or VR. Most recently, they were the AI guys that they call themselves. But as UX designers, we have the responsibility and skill set to push, what's practical, what's actually going to work, what's going to stick, and to ask, why is someone going to use this instead of what they're using now? And I know it's cheesy to say the whole ask why thing, but it's actually really important in this case, because if we don't, then it's going to be a lot harder for convincing people that this technology is worth it. Go to the next slide. There we go. So just to recap, these experiences should significantly improve upon the existing way of doing things, especially for wearable experiences, wearable AR or VR or mixed reality. Otherwise, the barrier to entry is just perceived as way too high for now because of the combination of hardware and the software constraints. And not only that, but how can we make these experiences delightful and memorable for people and have them wanting to come back again? Effective UX design is going to be able to counteract that reluctance you felt or apprehension towards the new technologies that you might feel. We have the necessary skills to ask those big questions and really dig deep into uncovering, really valuable opportunities to use AR and VR with both available technology and then also designing what the future could look like when we have these smaller form factor headsets. And what if we don't ask those big questions? Well, the first consequence is lost users, right? Especially for newer technologies, if it's not easy to use and people don't have that good first impression, it's not very encouraging to want to return or keep using it. AR and VR definitely have a lot of potential to really change the way we interact with computers and do certain tasks a lot more informatively and efficiently and effectively. But if we don't really take time to consider who's using it, what are their needs, the value added, and how they'll be using it, and really consider the whole experience, there's just going to be more friction and adoption will just take that much longer. So we've talked a bit about the importance of adoption and the role UX designers have in adoption of these new technologies. Some things that are in our control, like the software mainly, and some things that maybe aren't yet. But let's also get deeper into when it makes sense to use AR and VR. So, if we can curate practical experiences and focus on the needs of the users, we ensure that the experiences we create are not only novel and delightful and memorable, but necessary and actually add value to the users' lives in some way. That's the next section is when does it make sense to use AR and VR? And just a little spoiler, not always. So when you consider creating an AR VR experience, think about these questions I'm about to share with you. But just keep in mind, these are not comprehensive. It's important to consider your business's strategy, your clients' wants, hopes, and dreams, things like that, and budget, and other factors that go just beyond, could this experience high level face value make sense? But for the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on two key questions. First question is, why would people use this product instead of what they use now to complete some task? So some examples are shopping for glasses, as this guy on the bottom left here is doing. Why would he use it? Because it lets him see it on himself before going to the store without the need to go to the store or waiting for a shipment, which is really the goal, right? They want to see how it looks on them. And this just lowers the friction to be able to do that right from your phone. Another example is mini golf. I keep using mini golf. Sorry. Instead of swiping up on my phone, you can swipe on your phone to play mini golf. Now in virtual reality, I can, hold a putter, swing, and look around a golf course. I can be in space playing mini golf or in ancient Rome or wherever underwater, things like that. And with the haptics of the controllers, when it buzzes when you touch something, it actually feels like you're swinging and hitting a golf ball. So it's a lot more impressive than just playing on your phone. And then on the right there is batting practice, right? When you can't go to a batting cage. This is a company called Win Reality. They're based in Austin, and they help batters practice swings for different pitches and provide quality feedback and insight into how you can improve your swing so you can become a better batter. And a lot of people are using this from Pee-wee, T-ball, all the way up to like the Mariners or a few other professional sports teams are actually using this for some of their batting practices, and they can do it right from their living room. So it's super valuable in that sense. And then the second question is, instead of asking, how can we use AR and VR in our product? Instead, you should ask, how can our product or service be enhanced by AR and VR? So instead of trying to force it in, think about how this can actually improve, our product or service or offering. So an example of that would be construction training. You can train workers on exactly how to use heavy machinery to the point of muscle memory, pretty much, before they even need to touch the machinery, which is a lot of the times pretty dangerous and high risk for untrained people. Or like you were mentioning for pilots, you can train them to, again, pretty much muscle memory of what to touch when trained in certain conditions without having to do all of those different flights. Obviously, you probably still need their 2,000 or whatever hours to become a pilot, but this is just an example of how it could mitigate some of that risk and the cost of these round trip flights. Or a home renovator, in the spirit of Home Depot, could easily design their space exactly how they want it in virtual reality before they commit to it, so they can see exactly what it's going to look like and be more confident in their purchase. And then sometimes it just doesn't make sense, right? Sometimes it doesn't make sense to have some spatial experience, and that's totally okay. Maybe, for example, just having a pen and paper or an iPad to take notes is better than an infinite canvas for sticky notes, which that seems like a really cool idea, but when you're actually doing it and trying to write in thin air, it's actually a lot harder to use. And then just for some examples of when it makes sense versus maybe not. So when does it make sense? If you're trying to overlay some important contextual information on the real world. So for surgeons, like you were mentioning, for surgeons who want to see important information and visualizations displayed over an incision site, rather than looking back up at a monitor and back down, amongst other things. I'm not a healthcare professional, but that's something I saw, a use case. Or if you're trying to see what street you're really supposed to turn on, which I think is what you were mentioning, because you're super confused with directions, or there's a weird kind of ambiguous direction there. I've definitely been there. A few weeks ago, I made a wrong turn and added 30 minutes to my drive. I was very disappointed. AR can point arrows on the real world, mapped to the real world too, so it's super useful. Yeah, so if you need to deliver an accurate representation of some object is the second one. So if you're at a natural history museum and you scan to open an AR experience that lets you see maybe like a displayed scene come to life for educational purposes, just to see some important interaction in history, you could do that too. Or convey something to scale, which is a lot harder on a 2D screen than it would be to see, a fully grown dinosaur right next to me, which would be super cool. For try-ons, it might make sense. I think we were also talking about that with the glasses and seeing how things will really look into space even. So if I'm trying on glasses or I'm trying on lipstick, I personally don't shop for lipstick, but if you are shopping for lipstick, you can try on, any shade you'd like and see it literally just on your phone before making a purchase, which is super nice. Or just seeing how things look in the real space. So like the IKEA Place app, you can put furniture in there, or seeing different paint colors, which I think Home Depot has an app for that, seeing what different paint colors will look like in your room. For training and real-time interactions. So for AR, that can mean overlaying maintenance instructions on top of a machine that someone's working on and providing context to the physical objects that they're interacting with, so for some digital enhancement. And then when complete immersion is essential for the experience. So a training simulation, like the one in this bottom right corner there, requires you to be in the cockpit for a flight simulation like we talked about, or maybe you're doing some disaster response training. So you have to be in an environment to learn how to respond to different disasters, natural disasters or otherwise. So it can be a lot more effective to train in that simulated space versus on a computer screen, because you're really in the space. You're interacting with, the closest thing you can get to the real environment. And then on the other side here, we have maybe where does it not make sense? So if there's limited enhancement, when a digital overlay wouldn't necessarily enhance the experience and actually might cause clutter instead. So like in a navigation app to find like nearby cafes, if you're holding up your phone, it actually might just cause more clutter to your screen. You wouldn't be able to see the cafes as well because you'd see all these little tidbits of information on your phone. Discomfort or safety. So if using the experience for too long would cause people to be uncomfortable or start to feel fatigue, maybe it doesn't make sense to have it. So try to avoid experiences that require a lot of physical effort, like keeping your arms up for an extended period of time, except workout apps, obviously, because that's the point. If I go on a walking tour, like we're going to London, if I go on a walking tour through London, I don't want to hold my phone up the entire time because after 30 minutes, this gets really tiring, just doing this while you're walking around. And then the last one is natural interactions. So if the experience can be achieved through more natural means, like that pen and paper example I mentioned, like how they do it in any physical environment is what I'm saying. And maybe it doesn't make sense. Like a language learning app that requires me just to tap the screen and read and speak, like Duolingo. We have to ask what benefit would immersion really have there? Maybe there is some benefit or use case, but at the surface level, just learning a language might be better to stick to a 2D phone than a VR experience. Could be wrong. Happy to be proved wrong if anyone makes something there. Okay, so we understand when it might make sense to have some AR VR experience and generally what it takes to get people to adopt these new technologies, right? But what are some of the other challenges that we might face in this new realm of digital experiences? We're in a completely new paradigm, right, when we talk about AR and VR. And while some of the design principles we all know and abide by remain the same, the third dimension that we're adding now really opens up a whole new set of challenges and best practices that honestly are still being defined as we go. So let's talk about challenges in designing the experiences. So we talked a bit about challenges in adoption, but now we're going to focus on actually creating the experiences. So it obviously presents a new set of challenges for UX designers. And so I'm going to go over 6 things that I've encountered, and I know that a lot of other people have encountered as well when creating these experiences, and they're each super important to consider every time you're making an experience. So the first and most obvious one is now we're moving from 2D to 3D experiences. The nature of spatial design itself. We're no longer really confined to our screen in front of us, but rather now the space around us. That inherently renders our canvas infinite, right? It could be anything at any depth all around us. And it's our job to kind of reel it back to a necessary level and focus on just the task at hand in the given app. Whether that's like a direct interactable right in front of us, or we're in outer space, so objects should be perceived as a bit farther away. If there's a dinosaur, probably not standing right next to it, it's probably over 20 feet away or something. And then it's for us to determine how do we make the best use of that infinite space to complete the task at hand. So the next challenge is making sure the user is comfortable, both physically and cognitively. So with respect to ergonomics, both mobile and wearable AR and VR are not yet the most comfortable to your average user, I would say. For mobile, like we talked about, AR typically means you're putting your phone up to point at some space that's being augmented. Sometimes it's the rear-facing camera, like Snapchat filters or for try-ons, but holding up your phone for long periods of time can definitely start to weigh on the person using it. For VR, making certain gestures, either with your hands or controllers, or needing to stand for a long period of time causes fatigue. And then, obviously, we talked about the headsets are very bulky. So after like 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour, is when it starts feeling like it's squeezing your head a bit. So it's important to keep the experiences to a more limited time frame until we can get a bit more comfortable with wearing these devices. And another thing to consider is cognitive load. So we should ask, how can we focus the user's attention on what we want them to in this immersive experience, which can inherently have a lot more distractions because you can look around, pretty much do anything you want. There's can be a lot in a given space, and that can get really overwhelming to a new user. So really narrowing in on what we want them to do is a good suggestion for reducing that cognitive load. Next one is technical constraints and environmental adaptability. So you might see a lot of really cool AR, VR concepts out there that really just aren't practical yet. They're really cool, and they could be, a reality in a few years. But today, maybe not as much. But it's important when you design an experience for today to consider the hardware limitations. How long will the user have before the headset dies? How high fidelity can the graphics really be? What motions or gestures does this headset or phone enable, and what motions or gestures does it not? And although we're designing new immersive worlds here, the real world still exists. So how can we ensure that the experience is adaptable to different real world conditions like lighting, obstacles, interruptions, things like that? User context and real world integration. So if you're designing an AR experience where the intention is just to add digital elements to the real world, just try to be mindful that the primary canvas here is actually not your experience, right? It's the real world. And that means it's super important to not obstruct the view of the real world with the digital elements. And a general rule of thumb is, add as few digital elements to the scene as needed to make the scene work well. Otherwise, it can get really cluttered. You could be blocking someone like a pedestrian oncoming in traffic or something like that. I don't know. For legal purposes, I have to tell you not to do that. And yeah, like I said, the real world still exists, and we're now designing experiences that may require the user to move around, right? Whether you're doing jumping jacks or playing mini golf, or something else, moving their phone all around instead of holding it in front of them, making punching gestures, things like that. It's important to keep these things in mind so we can safely integrate our new experience into the real world. Accessibility and inclusivity. So now that we're utilizing 3D space instead of 2D on your phone, it's important to keep accessibility in mind. We always should consider the people maybe with limited movement, people with disabilities when we can, just as we do with our current digital experiences. It's not always possible to do that, especially since the hardware is still in its earlier days, but for getting to the stage of maximum adoption, getting past that threshold, it'll be really important to consider how all people can use a given experience, sort of how we do today and how we take that into account. And then, like we talked about before, remember the learning curve. So not many people are very familiar with AR and VR. We are, because we're designers, we're in the tech space, so we're familiar. But to a lot of other people, they're like, "What is that?" So it's still a novel and very exciting technology, and even daunting technology. And a lot of people are getting excited about new ways to react. And developers and designers alike are creating these really complex gestures and interactions, which is fine, but just make sure to construct some good onboarding flows or educational how-tos for your experience, either at the start or maybe there's like a tutorial that they can access, especially if it introduces anything new or novel, just so people can get more familiar with it faster. Social experiences and designing for multiplayer. So this is the last challenge we'll talk about. But now, does anyone play video games on their computer or any sort of multiplayer thing? Show of hands, yeah, some people. So in VR, it's now possible that while you're the only one in your living room or wherever you're doing the experience, you might have two other people in the same AR or VR experience with you, and their avatars could be next to you in the room, right? So it's possible that you're all in the same room with a shared AR and VR experience, and someone stands right on top of the main visual and blocks the whole thing for everyone. So if you're creating a multi-user experience, it's really important to determine how can it adapt to when more than one person is using it, and what are the different edge cases that we have to really consider so the experience itself or the main interactive elements don't get obstructed by other people. Another huge issue is, and I noticed this about 2 minutes after logging on to Meta's Horizon Worlds, is just like in today's social media world, just online in general, there's a lot of harassment, bullying, eavesdropping, things like that. So it's up to us to design these guardrails for these kinds of things, like both spatial boundaries, audio boundaries, because those are now in fact factors in these experiences. There can be a lot of bad behavior that can happen here, and we can't fix everything. We're still learning what can happen, but it's important to see what we can do to try to mitigate those things, obviously, because that's a big no-no. So now that we've seen some of the daunting challenges, once we really think about what makes AR and VR experience useful, meaningful, delightful, and practical, let's finally talk a bit about the foundational design terms and some principles and some guiding tips for creating experiences. So let's go through some terms first. So the first term is, well, actually, there's two terms here, scene and objects. So right now we have screen. I was really proud of this one. Now we're going to scene. Okay. So what is a scene? A scene is just a given environment where users can interact with other objects, other users, or just other visual elements. It defines kind of the spatial boundaries that, or where these things can happen. So it includes the settings and the boundaries of the experience, the visual aesthetics, interactive elements, audio, dynamics or physics, because physics is important now because we're in a 3D space, anchoring if it's an AR experience, things like that. So for example, you're experience might be anchored to your living room or to your kitchen or to a baseball field or soccer field, things like that. It's kind of just the place where you are pretty much, and everything that constitutes that digital place. And then objects are just the elements contained in a scene, right? Whether it's a 3D or 2D thing, it's just kind of, what's in my scene. So the image is kind of like, can everyone see that image there in the bottom right? Yes, over there as well, kind of. Okay, so it's a kid playing with, looks like an engine of some sort, and then there's the robot on the table. So can anyone tell me in this picture here, what would be the scene and what would be some of the objects?
Classroom,
Is which one?
the scene.
Yeah, the classroom could be a scene. Yeah. Does anyone else have an interpretation of what the scene could be here? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it could be the whole classroom, and it could even be the table where the experience is anchored to. That could be the whole scene. And what about the objects? Some more obvious ones and some maybe not as obvious ones. Yeah, the machine part would be an object. It's just some 3D object in the space. Yeah, that's definitely one of them. Yeah. Yeah. Anything that could be manipulated, and also think about if this experience, like you're saying, is if the scene is the table, then one of the objects probably is the table itself, because you have some reference point for where the experience takes place. So the table could be an object, or if the kid can interact with this engine in some way or manipulate it, his hands or controllers might also be objects. So it's really anything in your scene, and the scene is just any given space. The second term is locomotion, and inherently in the name, motion, how we move around. So how does the user move around? Are they floating? Are they flying? Are they flying around some space? Are they teleporting? So can I just point over there and immediately I'm over there? Is it a mix of both? Am I just walking around? Or driving in that car AR experience? So there's a lot of unique ways to move around or to implement locomotion. For example, this is a virtual reality kayaking app. It's actually not a real picture. That's a VR game. And in that case, the locomotion is you going like this with the controllers and the oars. I would generally say avoid flying around because it's super disorienting. It's kind of a similar feeling to when you're on a roller coaster and it drops quick. You're going up and then it drops quickly, and your stomach feels weird because it's going in one direction, but your mind's going in another. It's the same exact feeling, and it's not a good feeling. So try to avoid flying around if you can, and stick to teleporting or just walking around, things like that. But locomotion, again, is just how do we move around the experience? Okay, interactors and interactables. Very similar looking words, but they're different. So the interactor is, hands and hand gestures, or controllers, or the player's body, or now eyes even, because you can look at an object and it knows that I'm looking at it. Maybe one day feet, if there's some cool future soccer VR. Sorry, Siri. So it's important to just determine what makes sense for your experience, whether that's hands or controllers or something else. My recommendation would be to use hands for more natural, intuitive interactions and sensory feedback, where you can kind of enhance your presence in the VR if you're using your hands and doing things as realistically as possible. And then go with controllers for more precise interactions or just more comfort when you're holding something like that, or if you need consistent input. So if you're playing some video game and pressing A or pulling the trigger always is shoot or something like that, it's a lot easier to mess up making the hand gesture than just clicking a button. So that's maybe an example when you'd use a controller. And then there's interactables. So what are we interacting with? Something to pick up, a lever, a button, a UI menu in front of us, a basketball, things like that. So I put a picture here. I want to ask the question again. In the situation where I'm playing tennis in VR, like this person is here, based on these high-level definitions here, what would you say in a tennis VR game are the interactors and the interactables? If anyone wants to jump at this one.
Is the racket both an interactor and interactable? Because can it be both?
Could be both. It could be so technically. So the racket was the big plot twist here, which you got to right away. So the controller is technically the interactor. So the controller itself is the interactor, and it's attached to the racket, which is some object in the scene. So it's that exact instance is kind of blurry because the racket's moving in the scene as I'm moving. But in this case, the racket would be an interactable because the controller is the interactor, and it's constantly manipulating the way that the racket moves through the scene. That's a super good one because it definitely could ebb on both sides of that. What else in this scene might be an interactor versus an interactable? Oh, the hand? Which one would that be? Yeah. So your hand would be an interactor, and depending on the experience, maybe that's like I can pick up a ball, or I can slap it out of the way, or throw a ball, or something like that. But yeah, definitely the hand as an interactor as well. And then the other interactable in this case would be the ball. Exactly. So another thing that our controllers or our hands are able to manipulate, where it is, its exit velocity, things like that. So interactors and interactables are really just what are we using to do something, and what are we doing those things to, is how you can think about it. Worldlocked versus headlocked. So this is the last terms I go over. I promise I'm not trying to overwhelm anyone yet. So worldlocked this is where the object or UI in our space is fixed to the space. So I can see that chair right there. And if I turn my head this way, the chair is still there. Or if I turn my head this way, the chair is still there. It's fixed in the space that the experience is in. And that's a lot better for immersive purposes, right? If you're in some environment, you want to be able to move around the environment and it stays in the same place. That's world-locked content. And then headlocked content is when we fix some UI or object to the user's field of view. So like imagine I have a cube right in front of my face, and wherever I turn, it's just always right there, which obviously is not very fun. It could be like a heads-up display. Like technically in the car, like the heads-up display could be a headlock, but it also could be world-locked if it's like the arrows pointing around. It's really anywhere you look, it's fixed your display. So my general rule of thumb here is it's good for things like warnings or menus and things like that, but otherwise try to avoid those because the big value of AR and VR is immersiveness, and they'll take away from that if you have something in front of your face the whole time, like a phone, which you already have. And then world-locked content, besides those warnings or menus or things like that, is pretty much good for everything else. So just for immersive purposes. So just to recap, we covered some key terms like scene, objects, locomotion, interactors and interactables, world-locked and headlocked content, things like that. I obviously didn't cover all the terms. I could go on for a very long time. There's a whole glossary of stuff like object detection, occlusion, haptics. But we covered at least the basic ones to get a general understanding of what's going on here. So now let's get into some guiding tips and principles for designing AR and VR experiences. Sorry. So the first tip is use what we know about the world. And this ties closely to design metaphors. How can we simulate this with the real world? So how would you do this action in reality? How would you interact with those elements and those elements with their surroundings? So you can help people be more familiar by providing similar interactions with digital objects as someone would in the real world, like picking up a ball, right? You go like this, or pushing a button or pulling a lever, to have familiar things in there to help your user kind of indicate what to do. In the same regard, you can utilize hand and eye tracking to make these interactions seem even more natural, since it might be more intuitive to pick something up the same way you do it in real life versus learning the controls on a controller, which hand and eye tracking, that combination, are kind of where everything is going, especially with Apple's new headset. There's no controllers at all. It's just you kind of look at something and pinch your fingers, and that's that. And then lastly, virtual objects. If you have any virtual objects in your scene, which you probably will, try to keep them similar in size and physical properties to their real life counterparts. So for more familiarity. Tip number 2, comfort is key. I've mentioned comfort a lot throughout this talk already, but it's obviously super important. So make sure your users are comfortable using your experience. Whereas right now they're looking at their device, now we have fewer constraints with what they're looking at, how they're positioned. So for example, we don't want the user holding up their phone at eye level for too long. That's tiring. We also don't want them looking all the way up or all the way down, because that'll cause, neck strain, neck discomfort. Make sure you place the most important parts of your experience in the field of view of the user, so it's not too hard to find. If it's a more exploratory experience, maybe you're exploring a cave or the ancient tombs of somewhere, consider showing those things directly in front of the user, or having some indicator that this is where you should look, because they can really look anywhere. The same goes for standing versus sitting in terms of comfort. Does the user need to stand for this experience? And for how long? Or can we have them maybe sit to be a bit more comfortable while they're using this experience? They might need to stand if it's like a more immersive thing, like mini golf, or like a first-person shooter or a training module. They could sit if it's something like a remote workspace, if for productivity users, or a tabletop experience like a board game or something like that. Which brings me to the next one. Be adaptable to all kinds of spaces. So with virtual reality, you typically just mark an open space and you can move around that space freely. But some experiences, and especially with AR or mixed reality, you might have to pin or anchor some digital objects to your desk, or it may utilize a wall or a chair or a kitchen or anything. It's this awesome new thing that we have where you can have a Pokemon running around your room, like jumping on your coffee table and hiding behind your couch, or have a dining table be a board game for a family board game night, which is a thing that a company called Tilt 5 is doing, if any of you have heard of them. But other people might not have that table, or might not have the same space as someone else might. We can't rely too much on the space for the experience. That's because an environment a user uses might vary in size, layout, and different things like that. So someone might have a wide open space, someone might have a little 2x2 cupboard, someone might have a table, someone might not, things like that. So instead of mobile responsive design, this is spatial responsiveness, is how do we adapt to different kinds of spaces. And we can help coach the user even through different ways of using the experience depending on the environment they have. If they have a table versus not, if they have a big open wall to project something, or if they don't have that, how else can they use it? Otherwise, they can't. You could potentially be losing users. So general rule of thumb is try to determine the minimum amount of space needed for something to work, and use that as your baseline. Like, don't anticipate that you'll have this big open starter studio space. So yeah, someone might be in a very small bedroom or something like that. Tip number 4 is place objects realistically. So kind of tying in spatial responsiveness with comfort is being strategic with placing objects in your app or experience, because we now have a third variable when designing for AR and VR, and that's obviously depth. So try to make sure that any 3D elements in your scene are placed, realistic distance from the user, not appearing too large or too small, like a mug that you have, or a red Solo cup should be 3 feet tall, may be on a table instead, like you have right there. Since users can look at things from a lot of different angles now, instead of just head on, like on a phone or computer, another important thing is consider having key UI like text that you might have attached to an object rotate with the user so they can read it and look at it from any different angle. That's called billboarding. So consider direct and indirect actions. So direct would be like you have some button in front of you and you want the player's hand to touch it, or the controller just to touch it. Probably use this to pick things up in the experience, or push buttons, or grab a climbing wall or something like that. And then indirect interactions would be if there's something like a few feet away and you want the user to access it without having to walk there. You can use it's called a ray interactor, which is pretty much you have your controller and there's a laser pointing out of it. So you point the laser at, whatever you want and click a button, and allows you to interact with things from a distance. So this isn't Walkabout Mini Golf. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a really fun mini golf VR game. And so this is when you're playing in a level, you can see your score in all of the holes. And so this is, pretty far away, and you point your controller at it, and you can click to get to any hole, click to go back to the main menu, to resume settings, things like that. That might not make sense right in front of the user because it's, really wide, but just having it a bit further away allows the user to see the whole thing, especially if it's more information. 6 is provide UX affordances. So this is the same for all experiences everywhere, obviously. We always want to provide, affordances for people to understand the experience. And here, especially, we want to help provide some sort of cue that the user did some action and make it clear when the user can do something or interact with an object. So before I say anything, can anyone think of a good example of a UX affordance in AR and VR? You're thinking about something. I know it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a great one. So like if you're using eye interactors and you look at it, maybe it like glows a bit to show that you're looking at that. Or if your hand gets close to it, maybe it lights up to show, okay, yeah, you can pick this thing up. So yeah, it's a great one. Are there any others that someone has in mind or think of? That is totally okay. So some important ones or some good ones are things like hover states, or like you were mentioning, or like pressed or selected states. So I've pressed a button, I can see it, push in, or I pull a lever, things like that. Or maybe something has, that bloom effect or a white outline as you approach it, indicating that you can actually interact with it. Or it starts getting slightly bigger. There's a bunch of different ways you can add affordances, either by looking at something and showing that this is what you're looking at, or if you get close to something with your hand, showing that, hey, you can actually pick this up. It's not just part of the actual scene itself. We should always help guide the user, especially early in our experiences, because it can be really confusing and there can be a lot going on. So it's good to show them, how to use the app, how to interact with key elements, where to look, things like that. So if you see in the example in the bottom right here, this is actually a mobile experience, but you're immersed in a 3D space around you. It's not something that's directly in front of you. So I don't know if you could see it in that left image. You see a little hand pointing to the left, because the task is to search for something. And so the hand there shows, hey, you're looking this way, but the thing you need to find is that way. So there's an arrow saying, okay, maybe I need to turn my phone to look over here. And then in the right image, which is a little bit blocked by the zoom images, but maybe you could still see it, is it's showing you how to do a certain gesture. So it's kind of like with a wand, like a wizarding gesture like that. Which obviously is not very intuitive to know just to do a circle and squiggle like that. But with this affordance, it's saying, hey, this is what you need to do to complete that action. Does anyone think of any other UX affordances we might have now that we move to more immersive? Yeah, exactly. Like I pick something up, like, is that what I was supposed to do? Yeah, exactly. And you're raising your hand too?
So Stacy on the chat said haptic feedback, like when you get a vibration.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're playing tennis and you hit the ball, maybe your controller buzzes to show that it's made contact, because maybe you're not looking at the ball, you're looking up the court, things like that.
Change the options. But you don't need to use them like that. Like, let's say, like we typically want to do the forklifts, shoot out a box, it should be lower than the box.
Yeah.
And it's perched, walk slowly and breathe heavier. If it's cold, it's frost.
Yeah, so we're using very realistic affordances of things we recognize now as, oh, okay, I put a hole through that box, or someone is tired. How can we simulate that in this digital experience? Yeah, that's a great example. Another very important UX affordance, which is in some 2D experiences on the web or on your phone, but even more important here, is audio. So this is another very important UX affordance, obviously, because you can now that you're in the digital space, people are interacting with things as they would in the real world. So if I push a button in real life maybe has sound, so I should hear that same sound. Or when I hit a tennis ball, it should have that kind of whiffing sound that I'm familiar to hearing. Because you're not just pushing a button on your screen or swiping, you're doing something you know exactly what it feels like and sounds like. So how close can we get to that? And often in these more immersive experiences, that means involving realistic sounds and different audio elements to your experience as well. So yeah, like hitting a golf ball or baseball, pressing a button. If you drop a glass on the ground, you'll probably expect to hear it shatter. Things like that. And then lastly, keep safety in mind. So generally a good rule of thumb is don't encourage actions that will hurt your users. Also should legally say that. Like don't put a portal on the wall and say jump through it. I've actually seen that. It's not good. It's really easy to get lost in these like immersive experiences, especially VR when it's completely immersive. So we always want to remind our users that there is a real space around them and to be super careful. And Meta actually does this super well with the Guardian. If any of you have a Meta Quest, every time you use the experience, you have to set up a Guardian, which is pretty much like the open space from which you're going to play. And if you get too close to a wall or to the boundary, it lights up the screen red so you don't accidentally run through it. Cool. So those are some tips and terms for AR and VR, but let's look at some super cool examples of this stuff with what's available today. So for mobile AR, we'll start with, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with IKEA Place. And if you're not, it's pretty much, it's an app where you can go in and place IKEA furniture in your space and see what it'll look like. You can even see a little bit of an affordance there is it's showing like what's the ground level. So kind of like a reference of where this object is. And you can turn it around, you can make it bigger or smaller, I think, although I don't know why that would make too much sense if you're trying to see what their stuff will look like. But nonetheless, that is something you could do. So that's IKEA Place. This would be like an AR remote assistance. So you can see someone has their phone there. Maybe there's someone on the other end of that instructing them saying, okay, pointing at that thing, they click on it on there and they say, this is the clamping unit, go in there and do some action. And so it's helping people a little bit better do remote mechanical assistance is a super cool use case for AR that I've seen on the phone. And then, like I mentioned before, the lipstick try on. So I think this is actually a Snapchat filter where you can open it up and go through all of these different shades of lipstick and see with really accurate lighting how they'll look on you. So Snapchat had this new thing maybe 6 months ago where not only can you see the digital objects, but the digital objects inherit the real lighting and shadows from the room. So if this is like a shiny lipstick, you'll see the reflections of whatever's in the space around you in the lipstick, which is really, really cool. So that's another awesome example of something that we can really do today is, different try-ons. There's earrings, bracelets, hats. We did something with Mets jerseys last year, 2 years ago, or something like that. Mixed reality. So these are the examples I was talking about before. So it's using mixed reality to assist with total face transplant on the right there at the Cleveland Clinic. I think this was a few years ago. What they did was they overlaid CT scans from the donor with the recipient's face to determine how to align the two anatomies and determine a surgical plan of action. And it let them kind of look at the patient's anatomy in a 3D space and really be able to understand what's the best course of action and what is the plan for this procedure? Like, how can we perfectly align these? What parts do we need to transplant? Things like that. It could even help guide them in mock surgeries to see how different plans would go. Would this work better? Would this work better? And they can do that all in this 3D space. I think he's using a HoloLens from Microsoft without actually having to, of course, do the transplant because no one wants to test out a transplant on live patients before doing it. It's not good. This is what you were talking about, the car experience. So earlier this year, Audi and Magic Leap 2, not the one's bad. They came out with this demo. And while it's not something you can use today, this is like an actual thing that they made. Like this isn't just in After Effects or Photoshop or Blender or something like that. Like this is actual using a Magic Leap in an Audi vehicle. Be able to provide all these visuals of how fast am I going? What's like the center line of the road I should be staying on? Because obviously this is a little rougher terrain. I don't know exactly what the wheels are for. Maybe you can see how they're bumping up and down, but just generally speaking, it's showing how just a very common thing that we all do, drive, can be enhanced and provide more information to us through augmenting the heads-up display, and even just what's around us in the car. And then education, obviously, we're also talking about that, education of all levels. So you have a young person here who, my sister's a teacher. She's a science teacher for 6th grade, I think. And her whole class just got headsets somehow. But it's preloaded with all these cool science applications. So they can literally go inside an atom, or, a lot of higher level chemistry classes do these really complex and sometimes kind of dangerous experiments where they're mixing dangerous chemicals or going to incite some chemical reaction. Pretty dangerous, especially if it's an explosion. But now in VR, they're not just looking at a video online. They're seeing these chemicals mix in the middle of the classroom and can see what actually happens when 2 different chemicals interact with each other. So it's really enhancing the education experience there as well. And then on the right side, you see that they're kind of pulling the anatomy of that, obviously not a real person, but nonetheless, you can kind of pull apart the different parts of a human and see them in a 3D visual space versus on a screen, and collaborate with other people who are seeing the same thing from their perspective. And even the army is using virtual reality for more sophisticated heads-up displays and augmented reality for the same. Although at the current state of our technology, it was reported that a lot of them hated it and found it super nauseating, but the future is promising. But right now it's maybe not too good. And then this is some training examples here. So cockpit, just like he mentioned earlier, someone in the cockpit in the top right there. Looks like there's maybe a car mechanic here. It looks like they're under the car and learning how to maybe empty out the oil chamber or something. I'm not super handy or good with cars, but that's what it looks like. And then there's some military training in the bottom right to see, in a real combat area, how do we interact in certain instances, in certain use cases. A lot safer than actually putting people in the field to test those things out. It's better to practice in a safer space. And also education in virtual reality. So we saw the mixed reality examples. Here we are in virtual reality with, it looks like people are performing some procedure collaboratively. So this person has the headset on, and maybe this is another user and that's another user, and they're all walking through, okay, what do we do? How do we conduct this procedure? And then the right side is a cool example I saw online of similar thing, pulling apart the anatomy of the human body and seeing what those different parts are. And then this is the kayak example again, because I think it's super beautiful and super realistic. Again, this is an actual digital thing that you can play. This is not a real image, which is super crazy. But you can just kayak through any place in the world pretty much. And so tourism and going to like serene places is another huge aspect of virtual reality, is you can pretty much transport yourself to anywhere in the world and do anything anywhere in the world, all from your bedroom, which might not match the real experience, but it's definitely a lot cheaper than the real thing. All right, so we talked a lot about what the landscape looks like today, and we even saw some great experiences out there. But what does tomorrow look like? How could these new forms of computing evolve? And yes, AI is a very big part of it. I'll try to go through this part quickly. So first thing is better hardware. So right now, obviously, we're constrained a bit by the hardware we have. But in the future, we might have, a smaller form factor, like just something as simple as glasses. Or I've even seen that contact lenses are in the works. This isn't just like a fun fantasy. That's like an actual thing that's happening, is you put a contact in and then you don't have to worry about a thing on your head, and you can just see digital elements in the real world in front of you, which is super crazy. AR and VR will just be XR. So this is what I think. I think a lot of other people think this as well. But I think they're going to move away from being distinct concepts. Like instead of buying a virtual reality headset and an augmented reality headset, they'll just be one extended reality device. So you can kind of go between AR and VR depending on the experience that makes sense. Like maybe you're looking at a book and it has a picture of Egypt, and you want to be like, oh, that's a super cool thing. Let me explore that more. So I'm looking at this book and then I click on it. Now all of a sudden I'm in virtual reality and I'm in ancient Egypt exploring the pyramids or anything of that nature. And yeah, so Apple Vision Pro will actually have this. And I think the new Meta Quest 3, which is coming out soon, will also have this, is just being able to really easily go from AR to VR and vice versa, depending on what your experience needs. So better understanding of the world. So not only this, but also literally better understanding of the world with geospatial anchors, which is something that experience with the cars and navigation would use really well, is just pretty much anchoring digital objects to anywhere in the world. So you can go out to Big Ben in London and see something on top of it, or the Eiffel Tower, or anything. But in this experience here, and this is a big part of that AI will play in the future of augmented reality, is it detects that this is this user's guitar, and it detects the different parts of it, and it supplies this interface for them to tune it, see different song tracks, and maybe even see the sheet music for it and things like that. So a big thing that's going to be coming is not only understanding where we are, but literally what are we looking at? Is this the apple I ate yesterday? Is this my guitar? Is this my bed? Does it look folded to you? No, it doesn't look folded to me. Things like that. So it's going to really start to understand objects and pretty much everything in our space as well as we do. And 3D content will be more robust. So these are some examples, as you can see in e-commerce especially. It's going to, I think, become commonplace in the next few years for any e-commerce store with clothing, for example, will be accompanied by their 3D digital assets. And it's becoming easier and easier to just supply an image of clothing and it generates that 3D asset. And the reason for that is you'll be able to not only scroll through a store page and see all the clothes, but be able to pull it out of the experience and try it on in your space so you can see what it looks like. It's kind of the next evolution of the lipstick or glasses try-on that we talked about. All right, last section, I promise. Getting started in AR and VR. So we talked a lot about what AR and VR are, how we as UX designers can help with the adoption of these technologies, some of the challenges we're facing today with designing these experiences, some key terms, best practices, and we saw some cool examples. So just as we're wrapping up here, maybe some of you are curious how you can get started making AR and VR applications. If not, I've terribly failed. But the biggest question I always get asked is, do I need to know how to code? So if you asked me a few months ago, I might have said yes, but maybe not a few months ago, maybe like a year ago, I would have said yes. But recently, there's been a lot of cool no-code tools that you can use, like Shapes XR, which is what you see to the right, which they've deemed themselves the Figma for mixed reality. So it's pretty much just like going into a VR headset and seeing the other users just as you'd see collaborators in a Figma file. And you can create these prototypes for any experience. You can also check out Bezel, which is like Shapes XR, which is an app on your Meta Quest or something, except Bezel's web-based. So you can also just go on your computer and start playing around with these things and then also test them in your headset, which is super cool. For mobile, there's also some options that have a little, but some code, depending on how complex you want to get. So Lens Studio, for example, it's a Snapchat's editor to make Snapchat lenses. It's super robust, has a lot of capabilities and templates and even asset libraries so you can get started. You can create like full experiences, not just filters, like the lipstick try-on or things like that, or something like that to the right, which looks like a dinosaur game that you're jumping up a building. So that goes back to the geospatial anchors we were talking about, is this experience is just attached to this building. And then there's also Spark AR, which is Meta's or Instagram's editor for those experiences. They don't require code for more basic things. They have a lot of templates you can even use, but for more advanced things, you can also make it more complex with the help of code. Some things that are good to know code for are like Unity 3D or Unreal Engine, which are more robust game engines. Unity 3D is the one I would suggest. It's a little more simple than Unreal Engine, I would say. You can develop custom games for MetaQuest, Magic Leap, pretty much any headset, and even for mobile. Like it's kind of the standard now. Even Apple's allowing people to use Unity to make Apple experiences, which is super surprising. But this is something I made. It's really stupid, but I was really proud of it. It's just like playing around. I think it used very little, if any, code to do it, just because I wanted to see what it would look like to have a menu attached to my hand. And I did this in maybe a night. So you can get started with just like playing around with different interactions. And it's super cool and super easy to get started. And then you can also utilize some of the software developer kits, SDKs, like the XR Interaction Toolkit, Oculus Interaction SDK, AR Core, AR Kit, things like that, which offer a lot of these pre-made components where you kind of just drag and drop and start playing around with. And if you're interested in doing a full VR course, you can check out vrcreators.io, which is a super cool course. You can also do web-based experience, but coding is mostly required for those right now. With things called Eighth Wall or A-Frame. They're both super cool tools to make web-based AR or VR experiences. This is from a company called Illusion. They made this case study app called Spatial Fusion, which what's crazy to me about this whole thing is that this is a website. Like you're pretty much just going to a web page and then just having this completely immersive experience in a web page, which is just mind-blowing to me. I don't know if anyone else feels that way. But you can also make it for web, which is really cool. Another big question that a lot of people ask is, do you need a headset? And the answer to that one is also kind of no. Obviously not for mobile AR, like you just put that on your phone. You also technically don't need one for headset experiences, but I'd recommend it. But like Unity 3D and Xcode, which is Apple's IDE, and even A-Frame, which is that web-based tool, they offer simulators within their editors so you can test it on your computer without actually needing to go into the headspace. But if we're actually, doing research and understanding how we can improve this experience, it's probably better to do it on a headset. Last slide, creating 3D assets. So if you want to, make 3D things for your 3D experience, Blender is my recommendation, and it's free and it's very robust. You can check out Blender Guru. It's a YouTube channel. If you want to get started from like the very, very basics, he's famous for making a donut, which has like millions and millions and millions of views because it's like everyone's first project. So you can check that out. Also, Womp and Spline are other good web-based tools that you can use. But if you don't want to learn 3D or making 3D assets, you can also just get them for free online or use things like the Unity Asset Store and just import them directly into your scene and anything like that. And with that, that's it. Does anyone have any questions or anything at all about any of that? I know it was a long time. Sorry.
Jake, how do we get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can.
The question is, how do we get a hold of Jake? And if you go to the meetup page, we do have his LinkedIn on there. Do you have another contact too that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I can share my email out or something like that.
Okay, yeah, probably easier. Go to LinkedIn.
Yeah.
We have his LinkedIn on the meetup page where we allow everyone to see a little bit about Jake before the event. So hopefully everyone has connected with him. But if you haven't, please do so there.
Yes, please.
Any other questions? Just so folks on the call can hear too.
I don't really even know if it's like a question, but it's more like a thought or curiosity. And it's all, I guess, hypothetical because it's in the future. But with XR and whatnot, once people start getting whatever hardware, whatever is necessary for that, do you think, and I mean, speculating, that it would be like a universal experience? Or do you think people would have to buy add-ons for, let's say, a board game in a room or whatever else?
Yeah, it's a good question. Remember there was like the Web3 hype phase where there was like Decentraland and all of those things? Are anyone familiar with Decentraland? So pretty much when NFTs were cool for those few months, there was something called Decentraland, which is like you could have your avatar and it was like kind of one central place where that had everything, which is kind of what you're describing is, do I need to download an app or is it just like I can pull up a board game on the table? I think it'd be hard to have like an everything app. Like I think for a long time it's going to be like I download an app like on my phone for a board game, or I have, maybe there's something integrated with the operating system, like it can detect objects like the food in my kitchen to see if I can look at an apple and say, is this bad or should I eat it? I think maybe some things will be integrated or implemented into the operating system, but some of the more robust things like a board game or like any video game or like a training or some things like that will probably be their own separate thing.
All right, one more question just for the sake of time. We'll let you ask one more and then we'll pose questions to Jake via LinkedIn though, of course.
So what XR experience do you have? Like you said, you're working for Home Depot, right? So I was wondering what stories you may have, what lessons you may have picked up.
So I think the biggest one is you have to make it really obvious how to use it, or not, people aren't going to want to use it. Like, especially with Home Depot, I would say that a lot of the people that we've created VR experiences for are typically not the most tech savvy, even though it would supply value to both them and to us for if it's testing out a new layout for a part of the store, or testing out a new checkout experience. That's really valuable to us. But the people that we're testing it on, like the typical users of the experience itself, like going through the store, going through like the rental service or something like that, they don't really understand technology for the most part. That's a generalization, but for the most part, that's not like their persona. And so the biggest thing I think is like make it as simple as you possibly can. And like, depending on the experience, especially at Home Depot, you don't really need all the extra trinkets or cool fun interactions. You just need to be like straight to the point, and provide what you need to provide to get the information you need, and for them to enjoy or utilize the experience as you need them to. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Awesome. You can also ask questions at Social UX, which we'll do afterwards. So why don't we hold questions? Thank you, Jake. Let's give him a big round of applause, everybody.